The stagecoach door burst open and Sarah McAllister collapsed onto Cedar Ridge's dusty main street, her wedding dress torn to shreds, blood trickling from her split lip. 3 days married, 3 days of hell, her mail-order husband had beaten her unconscious and thrown her on the next stage out of Tucson with nothing but the clothes on her back. As predatory eyes surrounded her broken form, a lone rancher emerged from the shadows. "The lady's coming with me," Joe Coleman said, his hand resting on his Colt .45. "Want to know how a discarded bride and a haunted rancher built love from ashes? Watch till the end and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels." The Arizona sun hammered down mercilessly on Cedar Ridge's main street that September afternoon in 1882, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer like water and drove sensible folks indoors. Sarah McAllister wasn't given that choice. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Hayes, who'd seen enough human misery to last 3 lifetimes, helped her down from the coach with uncommon gentleness, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure you want to stop here, miss?" Hayes asked quietly, glancing at the gathering crowd of curious onlookers. "I could take you further west, no charge. Maybe California." "I have nowhere else to go," Sarah whispered through cracked lips, each word sending shooting pain through her bruised jaw. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, a purple-black testament to Thomas Thornton's final gift to his mail-order bride. 3 days. She'd lasted 3 days as Mrs. Thornton before he'd beaten her senseless in a drunken rage and literally thrown her onto the departing stage with a warning never to return. The crowd pressed closer, a mix of ranch hands, shopkeepers, and the kind of men who lingered in frontier towns looking for opportunity or trouble. Sarah recognized the looks in their eyes, some pitying, others calculating. A woman alone, obviously fleeing something or someone with no visible means of support. She might as well have had "victim" branded on her forehead. "Well, well," a voice drawled from the crowd. "Looks like someone's had themselves a rough ride." The speaker pushed forward a man in his 30s with slicked back hair and clothes too fine for honest work. His smile reminded Sarah of Thornton's expression right before the first blow landed. She instinctively stepped backward, her back hitting the rough wood of the stagecoach. "Name's Wade Garrison," the man continued, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. "I run the Sage Hen Saloon. Looks like you could use a friend, miss." "The lady's not interested," a new voice cut through the afternoon heat. The crowd parted and Sarah saw him for the first time. Joe Coleman stood perhaps 6 feet tall, lean but solid, with the kind of quiet presence that made other men step aside without quite knowing why. His clothes were simple worn denim, a faded blue shirt, leather vest scarred from years of work. A Colt .45 rested on his hip, not flashy but well maintained. His face was weathered by sun and wind, putting him somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter storm clouds. Wade Garrison's smile tightened. "Don't recall asking your opinion, Coleman." "Don't recall needing your permission to give it," Joe replied evenly. His gaze never left Wade's face, but Sarah felt him taking in everything, her injuries, her torn dress, the way she trembled despite the heat. "The lady looks like she could use employment." Wade pressed on his tone, suggesting exactly what kind of employment he had in mind. "I pay well for the right kind of—" "The lady's coming with me." Joe interrupted his voice, carrying a finality that brooked no argument. He looked directly at Sarah for the first time, and she saw something in those storm-gray eyes she hadn't expected. Not pity, not calculation, but a simple recognition of someone who'd seen their share of pain. "Is that so?" Wade's hand drifted toward his hip where a pearl-handled revolver rested. "And who made you her keeper?" "Nobody," Joe said calmly. "But I've got a ranch needs tending, and Mrs. Rodriguez just left to help her daughter with a new baby. The lady looks like she could use honest work and a safe place to rest, unless she prefers your offer, Garrison." He said the last part looking at Sarah, giving her the choice. It was the first time in days, maybe weeks, that anyone had actually asked what she wanted instead of telling her. Sarah straightened as much as her bruised ribs would allow. Her voice came out hoarse but clear. "I'll take the ranch work, Mr. Coleman?" "Joe Coleman." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect, rather than the mockery she'd grown accustomed to. "My wagon's at Murphy's General Store. We can pick up supplies before heading out." Wade Garrison's face darkened. You're making a mistake, Coleman. Taking in strays can be dangerous business. Joe's hand rested casually on his gun belt. I've made worse mistakes and lived through them. The lady's made her choice. For a moment, the street fell silent except for the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Wade laughed an ugly sound that made Sarah's skin crawl. Your funeral, Coleman. He tipped his hat to Sarah with exaggerated courtesy. When you get tired of scrubbing floors and mending fences, sweetheart, you know where to find me. I guarantee my beds are softer than whatever Coleman's offering. He turned and strode back toward his saloon, his men following like wolves called off the hunt. The crowd began to disperse, the show apparently over. Sarah found herself alone with Joe Coleman and the stage driver. Thank you, she whispered. Joe nodded once. Can you walk? It's not far to the store. Sarah took a tentative step, and her legs nearly buckled. 3 days of cramped coach travel on top of her injuries had left her weaker than she'd realized. Without hesitation, Joe offered his arm, not grabbing, not assuming, just offering. Hayes, he called to the stage driver. There a bag or anything? The old driver shook his head. She got on with nothing but what she's wearing, and Mr. Hayes lowered his voice. The man who put her on in Tucson, Thomas Thornton, he's a mean drunk with connections. You might want to know that. I'll keep it in mind, Joe said. He looked at Sarah. Thornton, your husband. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with shame. Was. For 3 days. Something flickered in Joe's eyes, understanding maybe or recognition. Well, he's not anymore. Come on, let's get you out of this sun. The walk to Murphy's General Store felt like miles, though it couldn't have been more than 100 yards. Sarah leaned on Joe's arm, acutely aware of how she must look. A battered woman in a torn wedding dress, hair falling from its pin's face, swollen and discolored. People stared from doorways and windows. She heard whispers following in their wake. Mail-order bride, I heard. Thornton's woman from Tucson. Coleman's lost his mind taking in trouble like that. Joe seemed oblivious to the talk, or maybe just indifferent to it. He guided her into the blessed shade of Murphy's store, where the proprietor, a round Irishman with kind eyes, took one look at Sarah and immediately produced a chair. Saints preserve us, Murphy muttered. What kind of animal does this to a woman? The kind that's not worth discussing, Joe said curtly. Mrs. He paused, looking at Sarah questioningly. McAllister, she supplied quickly. Sarah McAllister. She wouldn't use Thornton's name, not ever again. Mrs. McAllister's going to be working at my ranch. She'll need supplies. Put it on my account. Murphy's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Of course. What does the lady need? Joe looked at Sarah. You'll need clothes first off. That dress is done for. Sarah looked down at the ruined wedding dress, ivory silk, that had cost her entire savings, now torn and blood-stained beyond repair. I don't have any money. I said it's on my account, Joe repeated. Martha, can you help her? A woman emerged from the back room. Murphy's wife, plump and motherly, with graying hair pinned in a practical bun. She took one look at Sarah and immediately went into maternal mode. Oh, you poor dear, come with me, we'll get you sorted out. She shot a look at her husband and Joe. You men go about your business. This requires a woman's touch. Martha led Sarah to a back room filled with bolts of fabric and ready-made clothes. As soon as they were alone, the older woman's eyes filled with tears. That bastard Thornton, she said fiercely. Pardon my language, dear, but there's no other word for a man who does this. You're not the first girl he's treated rough, though you're the first to survive it long enough to get away. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank onto a wooden crate. There were others. Martha nodded grimly. 2 that I know of. One died. They said she fell downstairs, but everyone knew better. The other disappeared one night, and Thornton claimed she ran off with a traveling salesman. She gently touched Sarah's swollen face. You're lucky to be a live child. I don't feel lucky, Sarah whispered. No, I suppose you don't. But Joe Coleman's a good man. Quiet keeps to himself, but good. You'll be safe at his ranch. As Martha helped her out of the ruined dress, Sarah winced at the older woman's gasp. The bruises on her arms were bad enough, but her ribs and back were a painter's palette of purple, black, and sickly yellow. That son of a... Martha cut herself off. How long were you married? 3 days, Sarah said numbly. The first night he was charming. The second night he was drunk. The third, she trailed off. Martha worked in gentle silence, helping Sarah into a simple cotton dress, blue chambray practical and modest. She produced undergarments, a nightgown, another work dress, and a pair of sturdy boots that actually fit. These were ordered by a customer who never picked them up, Martha explained. They'll do you fine. She also insisted on adding a bonnet soap, a hairbrush, and what she called female necessities to the pile. When Sarah protested the expense, Martha waved her off. Joe Coleman can afford it. Besides, his ranch has been too quiet for too long. It'll do him good to have company. Why doesn't he have a wife? Sarah asked. Then immediately felt presumptuous. I'm sorry, that's not my business. It's a natural question, Martha said kindly. Joe had a wife once years ago before he came to Cedar Ridge. Elizabeth was her name. She died, though he's never said how. He came here about 5 years back, bought the old Sawyer place, and he's been alone ever since. He's had offers, plenty of women in town would marry him in a heartbeat, but he's never shown interest. Sarah absorbed this information as Martha helped her pin up her hair, hiding the worst of the tangled mess under the bonnet. A widower, then. That explained the sadness she'd glimpsed in his eyes, the way he'd looked at her with recognition rather than mere pity. When they emerged from the back room, Joe was loading supplies into a wagon, flour, coffee beans, salt pork ammunition, and other necessities. He glanced at Sarah in her new clothes and nodded approval. Better? He said simply. You ready to go? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The kindness of these strangers after the cruelty she'd endured was almost harder to bear than the abuse itself. At least with Thornton, she'd known where she stood. Joe helped her up onto the wagon seat, his touch careful and impersonal. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. As they pulled away from the store, Sarah saw Wade Garrison standing outside his saloon watching them with an expression that made her shiver despite the heat. He won't bother you, Joe said quietly, following her gaze. Garrison's scum, but he's not stupid. He knows better than to come onto my land uninvited. They rode in silence through the town and out into the desert. The road was rough, and every bump sent pain shooting through Sarah's ribs, but she bit her lip and endured it. She'd endured worse. After about 20 minutes, Joe spoke again. I should explain the situation. My ranch isn't large, about 300 acres, 50 head of cattle, some horses. I can manage the livestock myself, but the house has been neglected since Mrs. Rodriguez left. I can't pay much room board and $2 a week, but you'll have your own space and privacy. That's generous, Sarah said, meaning it. Most domestic positions paid less and rarely with the promise of privacy. There's a small room off the kitchen that was Mrs. Rodriguez's. It has its own door to the outside so you can come and go without feeling trapped. The thoughtfulness of that statement made Sarah's eyes burn with unshed tears. He understood somehow what it meant to need an escape route. They rode on as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The landscape was harsh, but beautiful in its way, red rock formation stands of saguaro cacti, patches of hardy desert flowers. Sarah found herself oddly soothed by the emptiness, the vast spaces where no one could corner her. Can I ask you something? She said suddenly. Joe glanced at her. Go ahead. Why did you intervene? Back in town, I mean. You don't know me. I could be trouble like Garrison said. Joe was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, I knew someone once who needed help. No one gave it. I've regretted that every day since. Your wife? The question slipped out before Sarah could stop it. Joe's hands tightened on the reins, but his voice remained steady. Yes. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He pointed ahead. That's my land starting at that rock formation. Sarah looked where he indicated and saw a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley between two ridges. The main house was adobe single-story but substantial with a wide porch wrapped around two sides. There was a barn, a corral with several horses, a chicken coop, and what looked like a small garden plot gone to seed. It wasn't fancy, but it looked solid, permanent, safe. It's beautiful, she said softly. Joe made a sound that might have been surprise. Most people find it too isolated. Isolation sounds perfect right now. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and red. A dog emerged from the barn, a mixed breed with intelligent eyes and a cautious demeanor. "That's Scout," Joe said. "He's particular about strangers, but he won't hurt you." The dog approached slowly, sniffing at Sarah's extended hand before apparently deciding she passed inspection. His tail wagged once, twice. "Seems you're approved," Joe said, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Let me show you the house." The interior was exactly what Sarah expected: functional, masculine, dusty. The main room served as both living and dining area, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a leather armchair that had seen better days. The kitchen was surprisingly well equipped with a good stove, plenty of shelves, and a pump that brought water right inside, a luxury in these parts. Joe led her to a door off the kitchen. "This will be your room." The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, a washstand, and as promised, a door leading directly outside. The window had actual glass and curtains that, while faded, provided privacy. "The outhouse is behind the main house," Joe said, clearly uncomfortable with the necessity of mentioning such things. "There's a hip bath in the storage room you can use. I usually bathe in the creek so you'll have privacy." Sarah set down the bundle of clothes Martha had wrapped for her. "Mr. Coleman, I need to be clear about something." He turned to face her, waiting. "I'm grateful for the job and the shelter, but I won't— that is, if you're expecting—" She struggled to find the words. "I'm expecting you to cook clean and maybe help with the garden," Joe said firmly. "Nothing else. Your personal life is your own business, Mrs. McAllister. I'll respect your privacy, and I expect the same in return." The relief that flooded through her was so intense she had to grip the doorframe for support. "Thank you. Supper's usually at sundown. I can manage tonight. You should rest. There's water in the pitcher, and Mrs. Rodriguez left some liniment in the dresser that might help with—" He gestured vaguely at her injuries. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He left quickly, as if eager to escape the awkwardness of the situation. Sarah closed the door behind him and sank onto the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. She cried for the girl who'd left Illinois 3 weeks ago, full of hope, answering an advertisement for a refined gentleman rancher seeking companionship and marriage. She cried for the humiliation of discovering Thomas Thornton was neither refined nor gentle, but a violent drunk who'd lied about everything from his profession. Gambler, not rancher, to his intentions. He'd wanted a servant he could also bed, not a wife. But mostly she cried from relief. For the first time in days, she was alone in a room with a door she could lock in a place where a man had promised to respect her privacy, where she could perhaps begin to piece together the shattered fragments of herself. A soft knock interrupted her tears. "Mrs. McAllister." Joe's voice came through the door. "I'm leaving a tray outside, just some bread and soup, nothing fancy." She heard his footsteps retreat. When she opened the door, she found a wooden tray with a bowl of what looked like beef stew, thick slices of bread, and a glass of water. Simple fare, but the kindness of it made her tears start fresh. She ate slowly, her jaw protesting every bite but forcing herself to finish it all. She'd learned the hard way that you ate when you could because you never knew when the next meal would come. As darkness fell, she used the liniment Joe had mentioned, wincing as she applied it to the worst of her bruises. It smelled sharp and medicinal, but brought blessed numbth to the pain. She changed into the nightgown Martha had given her, carefully folding her new dress. Through her window, she could see light from the barn where Joe was apparently still working. What kind of man took in a stranger like this, offering safety without demanding anything in return? In her experience, men always wanted something. Yet Joe Coleman seemed to want nothing more than help with his house, treating her with a careful respect that was almost formal in its boundaries. She thought about what Martha had said, that Joe had been widowed, that his wife had died years ago. Sarah understood grief, understood loss, though hers was different. She'd lost herself in those 3 days with Thornton, lost the naive girl who'd believed in fairy tale endings and mail-order romance. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and Sarah shivered. The desert was full of dangers, wild animals, rough men, the killing heat of day and cold of night. But lying in this narrow bed in this small room with 2 doors she could escape through if needed, she felt safer than she had in weeks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She'd have to prove herself useful, earn her keep, navigate whatever strange arrangement she'd entered into with Joe Coleman. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Illinois, she could sleep without fear of what or who might come through her door. The last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her was a small, carved wooden cross hanging on the wall, simple and unadorned. She wasn't particularly religious, but something about its presence comforted her. Someone had cared enough to put it there to offer protection or blessing to whoever slept in this room. "Thank you," she whispered to the darkness. Not sure if she was thanking God, Joe Coleman, or simply the universe for this moment of respite. Morning came too soon, announced by a rooster's crow that sent pain shooting through Sarah's head. Every muscle in her body protested as she forced herself out of bed. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand was hardly encouraging. Her left eye had turned an impressive shade of purple-green, and her split lip had scabbed over unattractively. But she was alive, and she had work to do. She dressed carefully in the blue chambray, pinned her hair as neatly as she could manage, and ventured into the kitchen. Joe was already gone, but he'd left coffee on the stove and a note on the table. "Working the north pasture, back by noon. Rest if you need to. J.C." Sarah looked around the kitchen, assessing what needed to be done. The answer was everything. Dust coated every surface, dishes were stacked unwashed, and she didn't want to know when the floor had last been swept. But this was familiar territory. She'd kept house for her father and brothers after her mother died, and later for the boarding house where she'd worked to save money for her trip west. She started with the dishes, heating water on the stove, and attacking the pile with determination. Her ribs protested every movement, but she found a rhythm that minimized the pain. As she worked, she planned sweep the floors, dust the surfaces, take inventory of the pantry, perhaps start some bread for dinner. By the time Joe returned at noon, she'd transformed the kitchen. The surfaces gleamed, the floor was swept and mopped, and fresh bread was rising under a clean cloth. She'd even managed to start a pot of beans soaking for dinner. Joe stood in the doorway, hat in hand, staring at the transformation. "You shouldn't have pushed yourself so hard." Sarah straightened from where she'd been organizing the pantry shelves. "I need to earn my keep, Mr. Coleman." "Joe," he said, "just Joe is fine, and you've more than earned it already." He gestured at the kitchen. "I'd forgotten it could look like this." "When did Mrs. Rodriguez leave?" 6 weeks ago. I've been managing, but—" He shrugged. Sarah could see exactly how he'd been managing poorly. The man might be capable with cattle and horses, but domestic skills were clearly not his strength. "I've got beans soaking for dinner," she said, "and fresh bread. Is there anything particular you'd like? Whatever you make will be fine." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Your face looks worse today. The bruising, I mean. Do you need anything Doc Morrison could—" "No," Sarah said quickly. "No doctor. It'll heal on its own." Joe nodded, understanding her reluctance. A doctor meant questions, possibly word getting back to Thornton complications she couldn't afford. "I'll be working on the fence in the south pasture this afternoon," he said. "Scout will stay here with you. He's good protection, and he knows to bark if anyone approaches." The dog in question was lying on the porch, watching them through the open door with intelligent eyes. "You think someone might come?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Joe's expression hardened slightly. "Wade Garrison might try to test boundaries, or Thornton might come looking, though it's a long ride from Tucson. Either way, Scout will warn you, and I'll hear him from the pasture. You're safe here." Safe. Such a small word for such a large promise. The afternoon passed peacefully. Sarah continued her assault on the house's neglect, though she paced herself more carefully. She found evidence of the home's history as she cleaned a woman's handkerchief embroidered with EC tucked behind a shelf, a dried flower pressed between books, a single earring fallen behind the dresser. Elizabeth Coleman's ghost lingered in small forgotten corners. As the sun began to set, Sarah had dinner ready, beans flavored with salt pork, fresh bread, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, which seemed to be how Joe liked it. They ate in silence at the newly cleaned table, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sarah had learned to distinguish between the silence of brewing violence and the silence of simple quietude. This was the latter. "This is good," Joe said finally, gesturing at his plate. "Really good." "Thank you." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Has it really been 5 years since you've had a woman's cooking?" "Mrs. Rodriguez cooked sometimes, but she was elderly and preferred simple things. Before that—" He trailed off. "Yes, 5 years." Sarah wanted to ask about Elizabeth about what had happened, but she recognized the wall in his voice. She had her own walls, after all. After dinner, Joe insisted on helping with the dishes, though his help consisted mainly of drying what she washed. They worked side by side in comfortable quiet, and Sarah found herself oddly at peace. This was what she'd imagined when she'd answered Thornton's advertisement: domestic partnership, shared labor, simple companionship. Not the passion of dime novels, but something sustainable, something real. "I'll be heading to town tomorrow," Joe said as he put away the last plate. "Need to pick up feed and check the mail. You're welcome to come if you'd like, or you can stay here." Sarah thought of Wade Garrison's leering face, the whispers that had followed her through town. "I'll stay if that's all right." "Of course. Make a list if you need anything." That became their pattern over the following days. Joe left early to work the ranch, returned for lunch, worked until supper. Sarah kept the house cooked. The meals slowly reclaimed the garden from the desert's encroachment. They ate together but talked little, each respecting the other's need for quiet. The bruises began to fade. The swelling reduced, though Sarah still avoided her reflection. Her ribs still ached, but she could move without gasping. She learned Joe's preferences without asking: strong coffee, simple food, everything in its place. He learned hers too: tea, when he could get it time alone in the evening, Scout's company, while she worked. It was Scout who warned her exactly 1 week after her arrival. The dog's sudden barking brought Sarah from the garden, where she'd been coaxing life back into withered tomato plants. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, and even at a distance she could see it wasn't Joe. He was too broad, sat his horse wrong. Fear flooded through her as the rider came closer. Wade Garrison, dressed in his town clothes, smiling that predator's smile. "Afternoon, Mrs. McAllister," he called, stopping just outside the yard fence. "Thought I'd come see how you're settling in." Sarah stood slowly, acutely aware that Joe was in the far pasture, too far to hear, even if she screamed. "Mr. Coleman isn't here." "I know. Saw him heading out this morning." Garrison dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post. "Thought you and I could have a private chat." Scout growled low in his throat, positioning himself between Sarah and the gate. "Whatever you have to say, you can say from there," Sarah said, proud that her voice didn't shake. Garrison laughed. "Come now, is that any way to treat a visitor? I'm here to make you an offer, a better offer than whatever Coleman's paying you to play house." "I'm not interested." "You haven't heard the offer yet." He leaned against the fence, trying for casual charm. $5 a day, that's what my girls make. Sometimes more if they're accommodating. You're damaged goods right now, but that'll heal. You could make real money enough to go somewhere else, start over properly." "I said I'm not interested." Garrison's smile faded. "You think you're better than that woman who couldn't keep her husband happy for 3 days. Coleman's going to get tired of you too, you know. Men like him, they've got particular tastes. His wife couldn't satisfy them either, from what I heard." "What do you mean?" The question came out before Sarah could stop it. "You don't know." Garrison's smile returned, uglier than before. "Elizabeth Coleman killed herself. Hung herself in that very barn you can see right there. Coleman found her when he came home from town. That's why he left Missouri, came out here to forget. But a man who drives his wife to that, well, makes you wonder what goes on behind closed doors, doesn't it?" Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Joe's sadness, his careful distance, the way he'd said he'd failed someone who needed help, it all took on a darker cast. "You're lying. Ask anyone in town. Ask Martha Murphy, if you don't believe me." Garrison straightened. "When you realize what kind of man you're living with, my offer will still stand. Damaged goods or not, you're too pretty to waste on a man like Coleman." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. "Be seeing you, Mrs. McAllister." Sarah watched him ride away, her mind spinning. Elizabeth Coleman had killed herself. In the barn. Joe had found her. She looked at the barn ordinary in the afternoon sun and shivered. What kind of man was Joe Coleman really? His kindness could be a mask, couldn't it? Thornton had been charming at first too. But no, she thought of the past week. Joe's careful respect, the way he announced himself before entering rooms, how he never stood between her and a door. Those weren't the actions of an abusive man, were they? Scout whined and pressed against her leg, sensing her distress. She absently petted his head, trying to make sense of what Garrison had told her. The man was clearly scum, but that didn't mean he was lying. The detail about Missouri Joe had never mentioned where he was from, but that rang true somehow. When Joe returned that evening, Sarah watched him differently, looking for signs of violence, of cruelty, of whatever might drive a woman to take her own life. But all she saw was the same quiet man who'd taken her in without questions, who respected her boundaries, who seemed to carry a deep sadness he never spoke of. They ate dinner in their usual silence, but Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. "Someone came by today, Puss," she said. Joe looked up sharply. "Who?" "Wade Garrison." Joe's expression darkened. "What did he want?" "To offer me a job at his saloon. And I declined." She hesitated, then added, "He told me about your wife, about Elizabeth." Joe went very still. His knuckles whitened as he gripped his fork. For a moment, Sarah thought he might explode, might show whatever violence he'd been hiding. Instead, he set down his fork carefully and stood. "I need to check the horses," he said quietly, and walked out. Sarah sat at the table uncertain what to do. She'd crossed a line, she knew that, but didn't she have a right to know about the man she was living with, even as an employee? She cleaned up dinner, went to her room, but couldn't settle. Through her window, she could see Joe in the corral brushing a horse with mechanical precision. He worked until full dark. Then she heard him enter the house, his footsteps heavy on the floor. A knock came at her door. "Mrs. McAllister." She opened it to find Joe standing there, hat in hand, looking older than his years. "What Garrison told you about Elizabeth is true," he said without preamble. "She did take her own life. I did find her, and it was my fault, though not in the way he implied." Sarah waited. "We lived in Missouri near Independence. I was a sheriff's deputy then. There was a man powerful, wealthy, connected. He wanted Elizabeth. She refused him, so he took what he wanted anyway when I was away on duty." Joe's voice was flat, emotionless, but Sarah could see the cost of each word in his eyes. "Elizabeth told me when I got home. I wanted to arrest him, but she begged me not to. Said no one would believe her, that it would only make things worse. She was right. He owned half the county, including the judge." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "I should have done something anyway. Should have killed him. Should have taken her away. Should have done something. But I did nothing, told myself I was respecting her wishes. She seemed to be coping. Then one day I came home and—" "It wasn't your fault," Sarah said softly. "Wasn't it? I was her husband. I was supposed to protect her. Instead, I chose the law over justice, propriety, over my wife's pain." He met her eyes. "That's why I intervened with you. I couldn't watch another woman in trouble and do nothing. Not again." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of fear she hadn't fully acknowledged. "What happened to the man?" "He died," Joe said simply. "Shot by an unknown assailant a week after Elizabeth's funeral. I was suspected, but they could never prove anything. I left Missouri the next day, came here, started over. That was 5 years ago." They stood there in the doorway, two damaged people carrying their ghosts. Finally, Sarah said, "Thank you for telling me." Joe nodded once. "Garrison won't bother you again. I'll make sure of it." "Don't do anything that would—" "I won't, but he'll understand there are boundaries." He turned to go, then paused. "You're safe here, Mrs. McAllister. Whatever else you think of me, believe that." The weeks that followed Wade Garrison's visit settled into a rhythm that Sarah found both comforting and unsettling. She woke each morning to the sound of Joe's boots on the porch, coffee already brewing by the time she dressed. They moved around each other with the careful choreography of two people learning to share space without touching, without presuming. The bruises on her face faded from purple to green to yellow, finally disappearing altogether, though the deeper wounds remained invisible beneath her skin. October arrived with unexpected violence, a thunderstorm that rolled across the desert like God's own fury. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching lightning split the sky, remembering another storm, another October when her mother had died. She'd been 14 then, thrust into the role of woman of the house for a father who grieved through silence and brothers who grieved through wildness. "Storm bothers you?" Joe asked from behind her. She hadn't heard him come in from the barn. "My mother died during a storm like this," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "Pneumonia, though I think it was really heartbreak. My father was not a kind man when he drank." Joe moved to stand beside her at the window, careful to maintain distance between them. "My father was the same. Mean drunk, meaner sober. Elizabeth used to say I was nothing like him, but sometimes I wondered if it was just hiding somewhere inside me, waiting. Is that why you don't drink? Sarah had noticed he never touched the whiskey bottle in the cabinet, not even for medicinal purposes. Part of it, lightning illuminated his profile harsh and beautiful in its severity. The other part is that I need my wits, always. Can't protect anything if you're stumbling drunk. The word protect hung between them, weighted with failure and determination in equal measure. Sarah thought of Elizabeth, of the man who'd hurt her, of Joe coming home to find his worst nightmare realized in rope and shadow. I should tell you something, she said suddenly, about Thornton, about why I left Illinois in the first place. Joe turned slightly toward her but said nothing, giving her space to speak or not speak as she chose. My father died last spring. Apoplexy, the doctor said, though I think it was just meanness finally poisoning him from the inside out. He left debts, so many debts. The house, the farm, everything had to be sold. My brothers had already scattered, one to California, one to the army, one to God knows where. I had nothing except what I could earn at the boarding house, and that was barely enough to eat on. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, grounding herself. Then I saw Thornton's advertisement. Successful rancher seeks refined lady for correspondence and matrimony. Must be of good character, able to manage household, preferably without family obligations. It seemed like salvation. We exchanged letters for 2 months. He was eloquent, charming on paper. Sent me money for this journey, met me at the stage with flowers and promises. How long before he showed his true nature? Joe's voice was carefully neutral. The wedding night. Sarah's laugh was bitter. He was drunk before we even got to his rooms above the saloon. Not a ranch, never a ranch. Said I'd tricked him, that I was older than my letters suggested. Not pretty enough for the money he'd spent. Then he decided to get his money's worth anyway. She felt rather than saw Joe's flinch. His hand curled into a fist against the window frame. The second night was worse. He'd lost at cards, came home raging. The third night, she touched her ribs reflexively. The third morning, really, he threw me onto the stage still in my wedding dress, said. If I ever came back, he'd kill me proper. The driver Hayes. He was kind. Didn't charge me for the ride, even though Thornton hadn't paid my passage. Thornton needs killing, Joe said quietly, with the same flat tone he'd used when talking about the man who'd hurt Elizabeth. No. Sarah turned to face him fully. No, he's not worth hanging for. Men like him always find their own bad ends eventually. Joe studied her for a long moment. You're stronger than you think you are. Or weaker than I should be. A stronger woman wouldn't have believed those letters, wouldn't have traveled across the country for a stranger's promises. A stronger woman might not have survived what you survived. The storm passed as they stood there, leaving the desert washed clean and smelling of sage and creosote. Sarah returned to preparing supper while Joe disappeared to check for storm damage. When he returned, he was carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. Found this in the barn, he said, setting it on the table. Been meaning to give it to you. Sarah unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound journal, water-stained but intact. The first page bore elegant handwriting, Elizabeth Coleman, her thoughts. I can't take this, Sarah protested. I can't read it, Joe countered. Haven't been able to bring myself to not in 5 years, but maybe someone should. Maybe it would help her words to be heard even now. Sarah ran her fingers over the leather cover, thinking of another woman's pain, another woman's secrets. Are you sure? Nothing in there could make me think worse of myself than I already do. He headed for the door, then paused. We're going to town tomorrow, both of us. You need to be seen established as under my protection. Garrison's been talking, and talk needs to be countered with presence. The thought of facing the town's scrutiny made Sarah's stomach clench, but she recognized the wisdom in it. Hiding would only fuel speculation. That night after Joe had retired, Sarah lit her lamp and opened Elizabeth's journal. The first entry was dated 6 years prior. Joseph says we should leave Missouri, start fresh somewhere without memories. But memories travel with you, don't they? They pack themselves in your heart like stones, and no amount of distance can lighten the load. Sarah read until her eyes burned, following Elizabeth's journey from Missouri to Arizona, her struggles with isolation, her deep love for a husband who blamed himself for every hardship she faced. The entries grew darker after the assault, full of shame and rage, and a crushing sense of worthlessness that Sarah recognized all too well. The final entry dated the day Elizabeth died was brief. I cannot wash him off my skin. I cannot wash him out of my mind. Joseph tries so hard to help, but how can he, when every time he touches me I feel those other hands I am already dead. Today, I simply make it official. May God forgive me. May Joseph forgive himself. He could not have saved me. I was lost the moment that man decided I was his to take. Sarah closed the journal and wept for Elizabeth, for herself, for all the women broken by men who saw them as possessions rather than people. When her tears finally stopped, she found a strange peace settling over her. Elizabeth's story was a warning, yes, but also a strange kind of companionship. She wasn't alone in her pain. She wasn't the first woman to rebuild herself from fragments. The next morning, she dressed with extra care in her better dress, pinning her hair in a style that suggested respectability without aspiration. Joe had shaved and put on a clean shirt, looking uncomfortable in his attempts at town presentation. "You clean up well," Sarah said, attempting lightness. "Like a mule in a Sunday bonnet," Joe replied, but there was a hint of humor in his eyes. The ride to town was quiet, but it was their usual comfortable silence rather than tension. As they reached the main street, Sarah saw heads turn, conversations stop. She kept her chin up, her hands folded calmly in her lap, projecting a serenity she didn't feel. Their first stop was Murphy's General Store. Martha Murphy's face lit up when she saw them. "Sarah, oh my dear, you look so much better." She embraced Sarah carefully as if afraid she might break. "And Joe, it's good to see you in town." "Mrs. Murphy," Joe touched his hat brim, "we need supplies, and Mrs. McAllister needs fabric." "Fabric?" Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Winter's coming, you'll need warmer clothes." He said it matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious. Martha beamed. "Of course. Come, Sarah, let me show you what we have." As Martha led her to the fabric section, Sarah heard the bell above the door chime. Wade Garrison entered with two of his saloon girls, painted ladies with tired eyes and brittle smiles. "Well, well," Garrison said loudly. "Coleman's brought his pet to town." Joe didn't turn from where he was examining ammunition. "Garrison, how's the domestication going? Mrs. McAllister house training complete yet?" One of the saloon girls giggled nervously. The other looked at Sarah with something like pity. Sarah stepped forward before Joe could respond. "Mr. Garrison, I believe you're confused about the nature of domestication. It's for wild animals. Mr. Coleman and I are simply employer and employee conducting business, though I understand how someone in your profession might struggle with such distinctions." Garrison's face darkened. "You've got a mouth on you." "I've got a brain in my head which seems to disturb you. Perhaps you prefer women who've had theirs beaten out of them." "Like Thornton tried to do to you." Sarah smiled coldly. "Thornton failed, as you're failing now. You see, Mr. Garrison, I've already been broken once. It didn't kill me, which means I'm no longer afraid of men who think they can break me again." Joe moved, then positioning himself slightly behind and to the side of Sarah, not protecting her so much as backing her up. "The ladies made her position clear, Garrison. Move along." Garrison looked between them, calculation in his eyes. Then he laughed an ugly sound. $3 a day, Mrs. McAllister. That's my final offer. When Coleman gets tired of playing house with damaged goods, you know where to find me." He left with his girls trailing behind. The one who'd shown pity glanced back, and Sarah saw herself reflected in those tired eyes, another woman trying to survive in a world that consumed women like kindling. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Martha Murphy said quietly. "Sometimes they're the same thing," Sarah replied. They completed their shopping fabric for 2 winter dresses, additional supplies for the ranch, and surprisingly, Joe added a small bag of peppermint candies to the order. "For your tea," he said gruffly when Sarah looked at him questioningly. "You put sugar in it sometimes. Thought you might like these instead." It was such a small gesture, the kind of thing a husband might do for a wife, and it made Sarah's chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. Their next stop was the post office. Joe had mail waiting, a letter from a cattle buyer in Tucson, a package from a seed company. Sarah watched him sort through it, his face carefully blank, and wondered if he ever hoped for letters that never came. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Doc Morrison approached. He was an older man with kind eyes and steady hands, the type of doctor who'd seen everything and judged little. "Mrs. McAllister," he said, tipping his hat, "I heard you'd had some trouble. If you need medical attention—" "Thank you, but I'm healing well," Sarah said quickly. Doc Morrison nodded, but his eyes went to Joe. "You taking care of her, Coleman?" "She's taking care of herself," Joe replied. "I'm just providing the space for it." The doctor studied them both, then smiled slightly. "Good. About time that ranch had some life in it again." He walked away before either could respond. As they started the ride home, Sarah felt the weight of the town's attention lifting from her shoulders. "They all think that you and I are—" "Let them think it," Joe said. "It's better than the alternatives they might imagine." "Doesn't it bother you?" "Your reputation." Joe glanced at her. "My reputation died with Elizabeth. I'm the man who couldn't protect his wife, who drove her to suicide, who maybe murdered the man who hurt her." Adding, "took in a ruined woman to that list doesn't signify much." "I'm not ruined," Sarah said firmly. "No," Joe agreed. "You're not. But the world doesn't see it that way." They rode in silence for a while, then Sarah asked, "Did you murder him?" Joe was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "I went to his house that night, planned to kill him, had my gun, had my rage, had nothing left to lose. But when I got there, he was already dead. Someone had beaten me to it." "Who?" "Never found out. Could have been anyone. He had plenty of enemies. Or maybe—" He trailed off. Maybe Elizabeth had a friend I didn't know about, someone who loved her enough to take that risk." He shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. Justice was done, even if it wasn't by my hand." That evening, as Sarah prepared supper, she found herself humming the first time she'd done so since leaving Illinois. Joe was mending harness in the main room. Scout dozed by the fire, and for a moment it felt like home. Not the home she'd lost, or the home she'd imagined with Thornton, but something new, something being built one quiet day at a time. "My mother used to sing that," Joe said suddenly. Sarah stopped, self-conscious. "I'm sorry I didn't realize—" "Don't stop. It's nice. The house has been too quiet for too long." So she continued humming, and later, as they ate their simple meal of stew and cornbread, Joe told her about his mother, a woman who'd died young, worn down by poverty and a cruel husband. "She protected us as much as she could," he said. "Took the beatings meant for us, kept us fed, even when it meant she went hungry. I swore I'd never be like him, never raise a hand to a woman. Elizabeth said I kept that promise too well, that I was so afraid of being violent that I forgot how to fight for her when she needed it." "You can't fight what you don't see coming," Sarah said softly. "Elizabeth said that too. The night before she died, she said it wasn't my fault that evil doesn't announce itself." He pushed his plate away. "But I should have seen it. Should have known a man like that wouldn't accept rejection." Sarah thought about Thornton, about the letters that had seemed so genuine, the flowers at the stage depot, the moment his mask had slipped. Evil wears 1,000 faces, and most of them look kind at first glance. That night Sarah read more of Elizabeth's journal. The entries were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, chronicling a woman's slow descent into despair. But there were bright moments too, descriptions of desert sunsets, pressed flowers between pages, small drawings of birds and plants. Elizabeth had been an artist of sorts, finding beauty even in her pain. One entry caught Sarah's attention. "Joseph brought me a gift today, a small mirror backed with silver engraved with morning glories. He said it was so I could see what he sees when he looks at me. But all I see is a stranger wearing my face, someone I don't recognize anymore. Who was I before? Who am I now? Can you rebuild a person from broken pieces, or do you just create something new from the wreckage?" Sarah set the journal aside and looked at her own reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. Who was she now? Not the naive girl from Illinois. Not Thornton's victim. Not quite the housekeeper she pretended to be. Something in between, something still forming. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. McAllister, Sarah." It was the first time Joe had used her given name. She opened the door to find him standing there with a steaming cup. "Thought you might like some tea, with peppermint." She accepted the cup, inhaling the sweet steam. "Thank you." He started to leave, then turned back. What you said to Garrison today, that was something. Elizabeth would have admired your spine. I was terrified, Sarah admitted. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it. He paused. You're not what I expected when I offered you the job. What did you expect? Someone broken, someone who needed saving. He met her eyes. Instead, I got someone who's saving herself. I just provided the space. After he left, Sarah sat on her bed sipping the tea, thinking about broken pieces and new construction. Maybe that was what they were doing here, not healing exactly, but building something new from the wreckage of their former selves. Joe with his guilt and grief, her with her bruises and betrayal, creating a strange kind of partnership that wasn't quite friendship, wasn't quite romance, but something uniquely theirs. The next few weeks brought a routine that Sarah found herself treasuring. Morning coffee with Joe before he headed out to work lunch together, when he could manage it evenings by the fire, where sometimes they talked and sometimes they simply existed in the same space. She learned that he liked his eggs over easy, that he read slowly but retained everything, that he had a dry humor that emerged in unexpected moments. He learned that she sang when she thought he couldn't hear, that she had a talent for coaxing life from dead plants, that she wrote letters to her brothers she never sent. Why don't you mail them? He asked one evening, seeing her fold another unmailed letter. Because they don't need my troubles added to theirs, and because I'm not ready for them to know where I am, what I've become. A survivor. A woman living with a man who isn't her husband, working as a housekeeper after failing at marriage. She sealed the letter in an envelope, adding it to the growing stack in her drawer. Not exactly the pride of the family. Joe was quiet for a moment. You could tell them you're my wife. Sarah's breath caught. What? In the letters. If it would make it easier. Tell them you remarried, that you're happy, that you're safe. Give them peace of mind. That would be lying. Would it? You are safe. And I think you might be happy at least sometimes. Sarah looked at him, lamplight casting shadows across his face. Are you happy? Sometimes, he admitted. More than I have been in 5 years. It wasn't a declaration of anything, but it was truth, and truth was more valuable than pretty words. November arrived with cold winds and the threat of snow. Sarah had finished one winter dress and was working on the second when Joe came in from the range with news. There's been trouble in Tucson. Thornton got himself killed in a card game. Accused a man of cheating, pulled a gun. The other man was faster. Sarah's hand stilled on the fabric. She waited to feel something: relief, vindication, sorrow, but there was only emptiness. When, 3 days ago, Wade Garrison brought the news to town, thought you should know. How considerate of him, Sarah said dryly. Joe sat down across from her, studying her face. How do you feel? Free, she said after a moment. Is that wrong? To feel free when a man is dead? He was dead to you already. This just makes it official. Sarah returned to her sewing, but her hands trembled slightly. I suppose I'm officially a widow now. Widowhood suits you better than marriage did. It was a dark joke, but Sarah found herself laughing, and once she started, she couldn't stop. The laughter turned to tears, and the tears to sobbing. Joe didn't move to comfort her, understanding that this was something she needed to experience alone, but he stayed a steady presence across the table until the storm passed. I'm not crying for him, she said finally. I know. I'm crying for who I was before him, for the girl who believed in love letters and fairy tales. She's not entirely gone, Joe said quietly. I see her sometimes when you're working in the garden or humming in the kitchen. She's just wiser now. That night, Sarah burned Thornton's letters. Joe stood with her in the cold November air as she fed them one by one to the flames. The last thing to burn was her marriage certificate. She hesitated, then handed it to Joe. Would you? He took it without question and dropped it into the fire. They watched it curl and blacken, reducing 3 days of marriage to ash and smoke. Elizabeth kept hers, Joe said suddenly. Even after what happened, she kept our marriage certificate. I found it in her things after. Never understood why. Because the marriage wasn't what hurt her. The marriage was the good part before the rest. Joe looked at her sharply. How do you know? Because I read her journal, she loved you until the end. She just couldn't find her way back to herself, and that wasn't your fault. They stood in silence, watching the fire die down. Finally, Joe said, "It's getting cold. We should go in." But neither moved. There was something about standing together in the darkness, watching the past burn, that felt like a ceremony of sorts. Not a wedding or a funeral, but something in between, a ritual for survivors. Finally, Sarah shivered, and Joe automatically moved closer, not touching, but blocking the wind with his body. It was the closest they'd been since that first day when she'd leaned on his arm. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For giving me space to grieve something that wasn't worth grieving." Everything lost is worth grieving, even if it's just the loss of what we hoped it would be. They went inside then to the warmth of the house that was beginning to feel like home. Sarah made tea, Joe banked the fire, and they sat in their customary chairs reading by lamplight. But something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had been crossed. When Sarah finally went to her room, she found a small package on her bed. Inside was a leather-bound journal, new and unmarked, with a note in Joe's careful handwriting, "For your own thoughts. J." She opened the journal to the first page and wrote, "November 15th, 1882. My name is Sarah McAllister. I am 26 years old. I am a widow, a survivor, a woman rebuilding herself one day at a time. I live on a ranch in Arizona with a man who is not my husband, but who treats me with more respect than my husband ever did. Today I burned the past. Tomorrow I begin again." The first snow came early that year, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, transforming the desert into something alien and beautiful. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching fat flakes fall, remembering Illinois winters when snow meant isolation for weeks at a time. Here in Arizona, Joe assured her it would melt by afternoon, but for now the world was wrapped in white silence. She was kneading bread dough when she heard the horses. Not one rider, but several their approach, muffled by the snow. Scout began barking frantically, and Joe appeared from the barn, rifle in hand. Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized the lead rider through the swirling snow. Not Garrison this time, but a U.S. Marshal's badge glinting on his coat. "Morning, Coleman," the marshal called out, staying mounted. 3 deputies flanked him, hands resting casually on their weapons. "Mind if we come in from the cold?" Joe lowered his rifle but didn't set it aside. "Marshal Thompson, what brings you out in this weather?" "Looking for information about a killing in Missouri. Man named Carlton Hughes shot dead 5 years ago. You remember him, don't you?" Sarah saw Joe's shoulders tense. Carlton Hughes, that had to be the man who'd assaulted Elizabeth. She moved to the doorway, making her presence known. The marshal's eyes flicked to her, taking in her flour-dusted apron and defensive posture. "Ma'am?" Thompson touched his hat. "You'd be the widow McAllister." "I am," Sarah said, lifting her chin. The title still felt strange on her tongue. "Heard your husband died recent-like in Tucson. My condolences." "Thank you, but condolences aren't necessary. Mr. Thornton and I were estranged." The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's so. Well, Coleman, seems you've got a habit of taking in women with complicated pasts." "Get to your point, Thompson," Joe said quietly. The marshal dismounted his deputies, following suit. "The point is, Hughes's widow has been making noise. Says you killed her husband, that you threatened him publicly after your wife's death. She's got money now, remarried well, and she's pushing for justice." "Her husband raped my wife," Joe said flatly. "Everyone knew it, even if no one would say it in court." "That's an accusation without proof, Coleman. What I have proof of is you being in town the night Hughes died. What I have is witnesses saying you'd been drinking, talking about revenge." Sarah stepped forward. "When did Mr. Hughes die exactly?" Thompson consulted a small notebook. "September 15th, 1877. Shot twice in the chest on his own property around midnight." "And where was Mr. Coleman seen drinking?" "Morrison's saloon until about 11. Sarah's mind raced. An hour to ride to Hughes's property, commit murder, and return in the dark while intoxicated. "You seem mighty interested in the details, ma'am," one of the deputies said suspiciously. "I'm interested in logic, deputy. Mr. Coleman doesn't drink. Haven't seen him touch liquor once in the months I've been here. So either he was drinking that night 5 years ago, in which case he'd have been in no state to ride and shoot accurately in darkness, or the witnesses are mistaken about seeing him drink. Thompson studied her. You weren't here 5 years ago. You don't know what Coleman was like then. I know what grief does to a man, Sarah said steadily. My first husband beat me near to death in a drunken rage. You want to know the difference between a violent drunk and a grieving man? A violent drunk's aim is true. A grieving man can barely stand, let alone shoot straight. Joe looked at her with something like wonder. Thompson, however, wasn't convinced. I need to search the property, Coleman. Looking for evidence. Evidence of what? A 5-year-old crime you can't prove. Evidence of guns, specifically a .44 caliber Smith & Wesson, which is what killed Hughes. Joe laughed bitterly. Half the men in Missouri owned that model, but not all of them had motive. Thompson signaled his deputies. We'll start with the house. Sarah watched helplessly as the men invaded their carefully ordered space-opening drawers, checking under floorboards, examining every corner. They were professional about it, not deliberately destructive, but it still felt like violation. When one deputy headed for her room, she moved to block him. That's my private space. Step aside, ma'am, Thompson said, not unkindly. We have to be thorough. Joe moved then, positioning himself beside Sarah. You go in there with her present, Thompson. Your men can search the rest. It was a small protection, but Sarah felt grateful for it. She stood in her doorway as Thompson efficiently searched her small room, trying not to feel exposed as he rifled through her few possessions. He paused at the stack of unmailed letters, then at Elizabeth's journal on her nightstand. What's this? My late Elizabeth Coleman's journal, Sarah said. Mr. Coleman gave it to me to read. Thompson flipped through it, his expression growing grimmer with each page. This talks about Hughes, about what he did. Yes. This could be considered motive evidence, or proof that Mr. Coleman had every reason to want justice through legal channels, Sarah countered. That journal shows a man trying to support his wife through legal means, not plotting murder. Thompson closed the journal and surprisingly handed it back to her. Maybe. They searched for 2 more hours, examining the barn, the outbuildings, even the garden shed. Finally, as the snow began to melt under pale winter sun, Thompson gathered his men. We didn't find anything conclusive, Coleman, but this isn't over. Mrs. Hughes has connections and she's pushing hard. You might want to consider finding yourself a good lawyer. I didn't kill Hughes, Joe said simply. Thompson mounted his horse. Maybe not, but someone did, and you're the obvious suspect. Don't leave the territory. He touched his hat to Sarah. Ma'am, you might want to reconsider your employment situation. Associating with Coleman could be dangerous for your reputation. My reputation survived worse than whispered suspicions, Marshal. Thompson shook his head and led his men away, leaving deep tracks in the melting snow. Sarah and Joe stood in the yard, watching until they disappeared over the ridge. You didn't have to defend me, Joe said quietly. Yes, I did. Sarah turned to face him. Did you kill Hughes? Joe met her eyes directly. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. I rode to his house that night with every intention of putting a bullet in him, but when I got there, he was already dead. Someone beat me to it. Who? I don't know. I've wondered for 5 years. Hughes had enemies, but most were too afraid of his power to act. It could have been anyone. Sarah thought about Elizabeth's journal, about the depths of her despair, about the friend Joe had speculated might have loved her enough to kill for her. Did Elizabeth have close friends? Someone who might have wanted to avenge her? Joe's expression darkened. There was one woman, Catherine Morrison, the doctor's wife. She and Elizabeth were close, but Kate was in Denver that week visiting her sister. I checked. You checked? I needed to know, not to turn them in, but to thank them, maybe, or to understand. He rubbed his face tiredly. It doesn't matter now. Hughes is dead, Elizabeth is dead, and I'm here. They went inside to find the house in disarray, everything pulled apart and carelessly repositioned. Sarah began methodically putting things right, while Joe stood in the middle of the chaos looking lost. They had no right, Sarah said fiercely, refolding linens with sharp, angry motions. No right to come here and disturb our peace. Our peace, Joe repeated softly. Sarah paused, realizing what she'd said. This home, this life we've built, it is peaceful, isn't it, despite everything? It was, Joe agreed. But Thompson's right, this isn't over. Mrs. Hughes won't stop, and having you here being associated with me, it could destroy you. You should consider leaving. Sarah slammed a drawer shut. Don't you dare! What? Don't you dare decide what's best for me. I've had enough of men making my choices. If I want to leave, I'll leave. If I want to stay, I'll stay. And right now, Joe Coleman, I want to stay. He stared at her, this woman who'd arrived broken and bleeding, who now stood in his kitchen, fierce as a mountain cat, defending him against accusations and U.S. Marshals alike. Why? He asked, simply. Sarah considered the question, finding the honest answer. Because for the first time in my life, I'm choosing where to be, not driven by duty or desperation or someone else's decisions. I'm here because I choose to be here with you in this place we've made safe together. Don't take that choice away from me. Joe moved then, crossing the space between them in 2 strides. For a moment, Sarah thought he might embrace her, might break the careful physical distance they'd maintained for months. Instead, he took her flower-covered hand in his, holding it like something precious. All right, he said. You stay. We both stay. Whatever comes, we face it. Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from years of hard work, the strength that had never been turned against her. Together. That night she wrote in her journal, they came looking for evidence of old crimes, but what they disturbed was new peace. Joe held my hand today. Such a simple thing, yet it felt like a promise. Not of romance or passion, but of partnership. We are 2 damaged souls choosing to stand together against whatever storms may come. The next morning brought Kate Morrison to their door. Sarah recognized her from town, the doctor's wife, a handsome woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and an air of contained energy. She carried a basket of preserves and a knowing look. Heard the marshal paid you a visit, she said without preamble. Thought you might need some comfort food. Joe stood aside to let her in, his expression wary. Kate. Joseph. She turned to Sarah. You must be Sarah McAllister. I've heard so much about you. From the town gossips, no doubt, Sarah said, taking the basket. From my husband, actually. He says you've done wonders for this place. And for Joe. Kate's eyes swept the clean-ordered kitchen. Elizabeth would be pleased. The mention of Elizabeth hung in the air like a challenge. Joe tensed, but Kate continued calmly. She was my dearest friend, you know. We spoke of everything. Her fears, her pain, her love for you, Joseph, and her hatred for Carlton Hughes. Kate, Joe warned. Oh, hush. The marshal's gone, and we all know you didn't kill Hughes much as he deserved it. Kate accepted the cup of tea Sarah offered. You were too drunk that night to ride straight, much less shoot straight. How would you know? Sarah asked carefully. Kate smiled, a secret smile that transformed her pleasant face into something almost dangerous. Because I was the one who kept buying you drinks, Joseph. Making sure you stayed in that saloon where everyone could see you until well past the time Hughes was killed. Joe sat down heavily. You were in Denver. I was supposed to be in Denver. I sent letters from there, had my sister mail them, but I came back early, very early. Kate sipped her tea calmly. Carlton Hughes raped my friend. The law wouldn't touch him, so I touched him. Twice. In the chest. With my late father's Smith & Wesson. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Sarah found herself gripping the edge of the table, staring at this respectable doctor's wife, who spoke of murder like discussing a recipe. Why are you telling us this? Joe asked hoarsely. Because that fool Agnes Hughes is stirring up trouble, and you need to know what really happened so you can protect yourself. And because... Kate looked at Sarah. I wanted you to understand that Elizabeth had people who loved her, who would have done anything for her. She wasn't as alone as she felt. Does Doc Morrison know? Sarah asked. My husband is a good man who sleeps very soundly and never questions my occasional trips to Denver. Kate stood smoothing her skirts. Now I should go before tongues start wagging about how long I've been here. Sarah, you're welcome to call on me in town any time. And Joseph. She touched his shoulder gently. Elizabeth would want you to be happy. She'd want you to forgive yourself. She'd be glad you're not alone anymore. After she left, Joe and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Finally, Sarah said, She killed him. Kate Morrison killed Hughes. And she'll never face justice for it, Joe said. No one would believe it. A doctor's wife, a pillar of the community, while I'm the obvious suspect with the obvious motive. Is that justice? Sarah wondered. Hughes faced no justice for what he did to Elizabeth. Now Kate faces no justice for killing him. Where does it end? It ends with us living our lives, Joe said firmly. Elizabeth is gone. Hughes is gone. The past is done. All we can do is move forward. But moving forward proved complicated when 3 days later Wade Garrison arrived with a woman in tow. Sarah recognized the type, immediately expensively dressed, artificially gracious, with calculating eyes that missed nothing. This had to be Agnes Hughes. Coleman, Garrison called from the gate. Mrs. Hughes here wants a word. Joe emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, as always when Garrison appeared. Sarah moved to the porch, her own hand resting on the shotgun she'd learned to keep nearby. Mrs. Hughes, Joe said coolly, you're a long way from Missouri. Agnes Hughes was perhaps 35, pretty in a sharp way, with blonde hair styled in elaborate curls and a mourning dress that emphasized her figure rather than her grief. Mr. Coleman, I wanted to see for myself the man who murdered my husband. Your husband raped my wife, Joe said bluntly. Whatever happened to him, he brought on himself. Agnes's composure cracked slightly. That's a vicious lie. Carlton was a good man, a church-going man. Sarah laughed sharp and bitter. Church-going men commit the worst sins, Mrs. Hughes. They just pray for forgiveness after. Agnes turned her reptilian gaze on Sarah. You must be the whore Garrison told me about, Coleman's new woman. I'm Mr. Coleman's housekeeper, Sarah said evenly, and you're trespassing on private property. I have every right to face my husband's killer. Then you're looking in the wrong place. Kate Morrison's voice came from behind them. None of them had heard her carriage approach. She descended with medical bag in hand, every inch the respectable doctor's wife. Joseph was in Morrison's saloon until past midnight the night your husband died. My husband treated him for alcohol poisoning the next morning, hardly the condition of a man who'd ridden 20 miles and committed murder. Agnes's eyes narrowed. You're lying. You're all protecting him. I'm providing medical testimony, Kate said calmly, which any court would accept. Your husband had many enemies, Mrs. Hughes. Business rivals, men he'd cheated, women he'd offended. Joseph Coleman was just the most obvious suspect. Women he'd offended. Agnes's voice rose. How dare you? I dare because it's true, Kate interrupted. Elizabeth Coleman wasn't the first woman your husband forced himself on. She was just the first whose husband had the courage to speak of it publicly. Garrison shifted uncomfortably. This was clearly not the confrontation he'd orchestrated. Agnes Hughes looked between them all, her beautiful face ugly with rage. This isn't over, she hissed. I have resources connections. I'll see you hang Coleman. Try it. Sarah stepped forward, surprising herself with her vehemence. But understand this, you go after Joe, you go after all of us, and some of us have nothing left to lose. There was something in Sarah's voice, an edge of barely controlled violence born from her own trauma that made Agnes step back. Even Garrison looked wary. You're all insane, Agnes said. Protecting a killer living in sin. Living in peace, Joe corrected quietly. Which is more than you ever gave your husband's victims. Agnes made a disgusted sound and turned to leave, but Garrison lingered. You've made an enemy there, Coleman. She's got money and spite. Dangerous combination. Like you're concerned for my welfare, Joe said dryly. Garrison grinned. I'm concerned for my investment. Mrs. McAllister here still owes me a debt of gratitude for bringing news of her husband's death. I figure that's worth something. You figure wrong, Sarah said. I owe you nothing. We'll see about that. He tipped his hat mockingly and followed Agnes Hughes back to town. Kate Morrison stayed for dinner, a strange meal where they all pretended normalcy while processing the day's confrontation. As darkness fell and Kate prepared to leave, she pulled Sarah aside. You love him, she said simply. Sarah started to deny it, then stopped. I don't know what I feel. Yes, you do. And he feels the same, though he probably doesn't recognize it yet. Men are terrible at understanding their own hearts. Kate squeezed her hands. Don't let the past poison your future, Sarah. Elizabeth wouldn't want that. She'd want Joe to find happiness again. After Kate left, Sarah found Joe standing by the corral staring at the stars. She joined him, maintaining their customary careful distance. She won't stop, Sarah said. Agnes Hughes. She'll keep pushing until she finds something to use against you. I know. We could leave. Start over somewhere new. Joe turned to look at her. Sarah flushed but held his gaze. Unless you prefer to run alone. I'm tired of running, Joe said. I ran from Missouri from my guilt, from my memories. But they all followed anyway. If Agnes Hughes wants a fight, she'll get one. Then we fight together. Joe was quiet for a long moment. Then, why did you really stay, Sarah, after Thompson's visit, after learning about Hughes, after all of it? Why stay? Sarah considered lying, offering some practical reason. But they'd moved past lies, she and Joe. Because somewhere between that first day when you offered me dignity instead of degradation, and now standing here under these stars, I started caring about you. Not as my employer, not as my protector, but as Joe. Just Joe who brings me peppermint for my tea and reads slowly by firelight and carries such guilt for things that weren't his fault. Joe's breath caught. Sarah, I know you still love Elizabeth. I know you probably always will. I'm not asking for anything to change. I needed you to know. In case Agnes Hughes finds a way to destroy us, I needed you to know that these months here with you have been the closest thing to happiness I've ever known. Joe moved then, slowly telegraphing his intentions so she could step away if she chose. She didn't. His hands came up to frame her face, work-roughened thumbs incredibly gentle against her cheeks. Elizabeth has been dead 5 years, he said softly. I've been dead with her going through motions existing, but not living. Then you arrived broken and brave, and suddenly I was breathing again. I don't know if that's love or need or just two damaged people recognizing each other, but Sarah, you've brought me back to life. He kissed her, then, careful and questioning, nothing like Thornton's brutal claiming. Sarah kissed him back, tasting coffee and sorrow and something that might have been hope. When they parted, she was trembling. What do we do now? Now we go inside. We have our tea. We sit by the fire. And tomorrow we face whatever comes, together. They walked back to the house, hand in hand, no longer employer and housekeeper, but something more complex, more precious. Inside, Sarah made tea with peppermint while Joe built up the fire. They sat in their respective chairs, but the space between them hummed with new awareness. I should tell you something, Joe said suddenly. About Elizabeth's death. About what really happened that day. Sarah waited, sensing this was something he'd never spoken aloud. She was pregnant, he said quietly. From the rape. She couldn't bear carrying Hughes's child. That's why that's what finally broke her. She left a note explaining, but I burned it. Couldn't let anyone know. Couldn't let that be her legacy. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Joe, I failed her twice over. Failed to protect her from Hughes, failed to see how desperate she was. When Kate killed Hughes, part of me was grateful, but part of me was angry. It should have been me. I should have been the one to avenge her. Vengeance wouldn't have brought her back. No, but it might have brought me peace. Sarah rose from her chair and did something she'd never done before she went to him, settling onto the arm of his chair, letting him pull her against his side. Peace doesn't come from vengeance. It comes from this. From choosing to live despite the pain, from building something new from the ashes. They sat like that as the fire burned low, two people who'd found each other across miles of hurt and years of loneliness. Outside, winter wind howled across the desert, but inside they were warm, they were safe, they were home. The winter deepened, bringing a peace that Sarah knew couldn't last. She and Joe had crossed a line that night under the stars, though they maintained separate rooms, separate lives in daylight. But in the evenings, she would curl against his side by the fire, and sometimes he would stroke her hair while reading aloud from whatever book he'd borrowed from town. They didn't speak of love or future, but something precious grew between them in the quiet moments, fragile as frost on window glass. It was a Tuesday morning in early December when everything changed. Sarah was hanging laundry, fighting the cold wind that tried to tear the sheets from her hands when she saw riders approaching. Not the marshal this time, but three men in city clothes, their horses too fine for ranch work. Behind them came a carriage, and Sarah's stomach dropped when she recognized Agnes Hughes's blonde curls through the window. Joe emerged from the barn, and Sarah saw him check his gun before walking toward the gate. She abandoned the laundry and moved to the porch, grateful for the shotgun just inside the door. "Coleman?" the lead rider called out. He was young, perhaps 30, with the soft look of a man who'd never worked with his hands. "I'm William Prescott, attorney at law. I represent Mrs. Agnes Hughes in the matter of her husband's murder." "There's no matter to represent," Joe said evenly. "The marshal found no evidence." "The marshal found no evidence here," Prescott corrected. "However, new information has come to light." He produced a document from his coat. "This is a sworn affidavit from one Marcus Townsend who claims you paid him $50 to kill Carlton Hughes." Sarah saw Joe's jaw tighten. "I don't know any Marcus Townsend." "He says otherwise. Says you approached him in Morrison's saloon the night of September 15th, 1877. Says you were drunk, angry, talking about your wife. Says you offered him money to do what you couldn't." Agnes Hughes stepped down from the carriage, her face triumphant. "You thought you were so clever establishing an alibi, but hiring someone else to pull the trigger, that's still murder, Mr. Coleman." Sarah moved down from the porch, unable to stay silent. This Townsend person just happened to remember this conversation 5 years later. How convenient that his memory improves just when Mrs. Hughes arrives with her money. Prescott turned his cold gaze on her. "You would be Sarah McAllister, the runaway wife turned housekeeper. Your testimony won't carry much weight, I'm afraid. A woman of questionable morals living in sin with her employer." "We're not—" Sarah began hotly, but Joe cut her off. "Where is this Townsend? If he's making accusations, let him make them to my face." "He's prepared to testify in court," Prescott said. "In Missouri, where you'll be extradited to stand trial." "Missouri?" Joe laughed bitterly. "Where Hughes owned half the judges, where his widow has remarried into even more power. That's not justice, that's a lynching with legal decorations." Agnes smiled coldly. "It's more than you gave my Carlton." "Your Carlton was a rapist," Sarah said flatly. "Whatever happened to him, he earned it." Agnes moved faster than Sarah expected, her hand cracking across Sarah's face, with enough force to send her stumbling. Joe lunged forward, but the other riders drew their guns. "Touch her and I'll kill you," Joe said, his voice deadly quiet. "Like you killed my husband," Agnes taunted. "Go ahead, show everyone what kind of man you really are." Sarah straightened, tasting blood where her lip had split again. The pain brought back memories of Thornton, but also strength. She was not that frightened bride anymore. "I know exactly what kind of man Joe Coleman is," she said clearly. "He's the kind who offers shelter without demanding payment in flesh. The kind who respects boundaries and honors grief. The kind who carries guilt for things beyond his control because he actually has a conscience, unlike your late husband." "You stupid little whore," Agnes began, but Sarah laughed. "Is that the best you can do? Call me names. I've been called worse by better people. At least I'm not the one who had to buy a witness because the truth doesn't support my cause." Prescott intervened before Agnes could respond. "Mr. Coleman, you have two choices. Come with us voluntarily to Missouri or wait for the federal marshals to drag you there in chains. Mrs. Hughes has considerable influence." "I need time to arrange my affairs," Joe said. "The ranch, the livestock." 3 days, Prescott said. "We'll be staying in town. If you run, every lawman in the territory will be looking for you." They left in a cloud of dust and satisfaction, Agnes Hughes's laughter carrying on the wind like a curse. Sarah and Joe stood in the yard, the reality of the situation settling over them like a shroud. "You have to run," Sarah said immediately. "Tonight. Take what you can carry and disappear. Mexico, maybe, or California." "No." Joe touched her face gently where Agnes had struck her. "I'm done running. If I disappear, you know what they'll say. That I was guilty, that I killed Hughes and fled justice. Better to be thought guilty and free than innocent and hanged." Joe pulled her against him, holding her tight. "What kind of life would that be?" Always looking over my shoulder, never able to stay anywhere long enough to build something real. Never able to. He pulled back to look at her. Never able to marry you if you'd have me. Sarah's breath caught. Joe, I know it's not the time, but there might not be another time. He cupped her face in his hands. Sarah McAllister, I love you. Not as a replacement for Elizabeth, not as convenience or comfort, but as yourself. You came into my life broken and bleeding, and somehow you put me back together while healing yourself. If I have to go to Missouri, if I have to stand trial, I need you to know that. I love you too, Sarah whispered. But love isn't enough if you're dead. Then we need to make sure I don't die. They spent the rest of the day preparing, though, for what Sarah wasn't sure. Joe wrote out papers giving her authority over the ranch if he didn't return. Sarah packed a bag with clothes and supplies, though Joe insisted he wouldn't run. As night fell, Kate Morrison arrived with her husband, both of them grim-faced. This is my fault, Kate said without preamble. I should have been more thorough. What do you mean? Joe asked. Kate looked older than her years, weighed down by secrets. When I killed Hughes, I thought I was careful. But there was someone else there that night, Marcus Townsend. He was hiding in Hughes's stable planning to rob him after he went to bed. He saw me leave. He's been blackmailing me for 5 years. The silence in the room was deafening. Doc Morrison stared at his wife as if seeing a stranger. Kate, what are you saying? I'm saying I killed Carlton Hughes, dear. Shot him twice for what he did to Elizabeth. She turned to her husband with sad eyes. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I never wanted you to know. Doc Morrison sank into a chair, his face pale. 5 years. You've been carrying this for 5 years. I've been paying Townsend for 5 years, Kate corrected. Small amounts enough to keep him quiet. But Agnes Hughes must have offered him more to lie about Joe. So, tell the truth, Sarah said urgently. Tell them you killed Hughes. Kate laughed bitterly. Who would believe me? A respectable doctor's wife confessing to murder. They'd say I was covering for Joe, that he'd somehow convinced me to lie for him. And even if they did believe me, I'd hang. Then Townsend would still testify that Joe hired him, and Joe would hang too. There has to be something we can do, Sarah insisted. Doc Morrison stood slowly, his medical bag in hand. There is. He walked to the door, paused. I need to think. Kate, come home with me. Joe, don't do anything rash. Let me think. After they left, Joe and Sarah sat by the fire, the weight of approaching doom heavy between them. You should leave, Joe said quietly. This isn't your fight. Everything about you is my fight now, Sarah replied. For better or worse, remember, even if we're not officially married. We could be, Joe said suddenly. Right now, wake up Reverend Mills, make it legal. Then at least you'd have the ranch if... Stop. Sarah pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't talk about after. We're going to find a way through this. But she didn't believe it, and neither did he. They stayed up all night holding each other by the dying fire, not making love, but memorizing each other's presence, storing up warmth against the cold to come. Dawn brought unexpected salvation in the form of Scout barking frantically at a lone rider. Not someone from town, but a stranger, weathered and travel-worn with eyes that had seen too much. He stopped at the gate, hands visible and empty. Joe Coleman, he called. Joe stepped onto the porch, rifle ready. Who's asking? Name's Samuel McAllister, Sarah gasped, pushing past Joe. Samuel, Sam. She ran to the gate, staring up at the rider. My God, it is you. Her brother dismounted slowly, and Sarah threw herself into his arms, sobbing into his chest, as she hadn't done since she was a child. Sam held her tight, his own eyes wet. Sarah, Jesus. Sarah, I thought you were dead. When I heard what Thornton did to you when they said you disappeared, how did you find me? Sarah pulled back to look at him. He was thinner than she remembered, harder, with new scars on his hands, and a weariness that spoke of difficult years. I've been looking for months, tracked you to the stage line, then here. Heard in town you were working for Coleman. His eyes moved to Joe, assessing. This the man who took you in? This is Joe, Sarah said simply. Sam, so much has happened. I know about Thornton dying. Good riddance. Sam's expression darkened. Also heard about this business with Agnes Hughes. That's actually why I'm here. Joe stepped forward. You know something about Hughes? Sam smiled grimly. I know Marcus Townsend is a lying piece of trash who'll say anything for money. I also know he was in Kansas the night Hughes died because I was playing cards with him in a saloon in Dodge City. Sarah stared at her brother. You can prove that. Got the arrest record to prove it. We both spent 3 days in jail for fighting after he accused me of cheating. Which I was, but that's beside the point. September 15th through 18th, 1877, we were guests of the Dodge City Jail. There's no way he was in Missouri killing Hughes or talking to Coleman. Joe sagged against the porch rail. You're certain. Dead certain. I already sent a telegram to the sheriff in Dodge asking him to send the records. Should be here tomorrow, but I wanted to ride ahead and make sure Sarah was all right. He looked between them, understanding dawning. You two are together, aren't you? Really, together? Sarah took Joe's hand. Yes. Sam studied Joe for a long moment. You treat her right. I try to. Trying's not enough. My sister's been through hell. She deserves better than trying. Sam, Sarah warned, but Joe interrupted. You're right. She deserves everything good this world has to offer. I can't give her that, but I can give her respect, safety, and whatever love I have left to offer. Sam nodded slowly. That'll do for now. But Coleman, you hurt her, and what happened to Hughes will look like mercy compared to what I'll do to you. Fair enough? They brought Sam inside, fed him breakfast while he told his story. After their father's death, he drifted west, working cattle drives, playing cards, staying one step ahead of trouble. When I finally saved enough money to come home, you were gone. The neighbors said you'd married some man from Tucson, but when I tracked him down, he was dead, Sarah finished. And you'd vanished. Took me 2 months to find someone who remembered you getting on that stage to Cedar Ridge. Sam squeezed her hand. I thought I'd lost you too after losing everyone else. The others. Tom died in a mining accident in California. David drank himself to death last year. Couldn't handle the war memories. Sam's voice was hollow. You and I are all that's left of the McAllisters. Sarah cried then for brothers she'd never see again, for the family scattered by their father's cruelty and poverty's demands. Joe stood quietly, giving the siblings their moment of grief. A commotion outside interrupted them. Prescott had arrived with Agnes Hughes and several armed men, but Doc Morrison was with them, along with Marshal Thompson and surprisingly Judge Anderson from Tucson. What's this about? Joe demanded, stepping onto the porch. Judge Anderson, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, dismounted carefully. It's about Justice Mr. Coleman. Doc Morrison sent me an urgent telegram last night. I've come to take depositions and determine if there's cause for extradition. Agnes Hughes protested immediately. This is irregular. The trial should be in Missouri. The determination of whether there should be a trial at all will be made here, Judge Anderson said firmly. Doc Morrison has raised serious questions about your witness. Sam stepped forward. That witness is a fraud, Judge. Marcus Townsend was in Kansas when Hughes was killed. I can prove it. The judge's eyebrows rose. And you are? Samuel McAllister. This is my sister. He produced a worn paper from his pocket. Copy of the arrest record from Dodge City. The sheriff there is sending the official documents. Judge Anderson examined the paper, then turned to Agnes. Your witness was in jail in Kansas on the night in question. Agnes's beautiful face contorted with rage. That's impossible. He swore. He lied, Sam said flatly. Probably for money. How much did you pay him? Mrs. Hughes, this is ridiculous. Agnes turned to Prescott. Do something. But Prescott was already backing away, seeing the case collapse. Mrs. Hughes, if this documentation is accurate, it can't be. Agnes was nearly screaming now. Coleman killed my husband. Everyone knows it. Everyone suspects it, Judge Anderson corrected. But suspicion isn't proof, and now your only witness is proven a fraud. Kate Morrison stepped forward, then her decision made. Your Honor, if I may. Doc Morrison tried to stop her. Kate, no. It's time for truth, Kate said firmly. She faced the judge squarely. Marcus Townsend has been blackmailing me for 5 years. Not because I hired him, but because he saw me leaving the Hughes property the night Carlton died. The silence was absolute. Agnes Hughes stared at Kate in shock. You killed Carlton. He raped my best friend, Kate said simply. The law wouldn't touch him. So I did. Judge Anderson looked deeply uncomfortable. Mrs. Morrison, are you confessing to murder? I'm confessing to justice, Your Honor. Carlton Hughes was a monster who hurt countless women. Elizabeth Coleman was just the last straw. Doc Morrison moved to stand beside his wife, taking her hand. Your Honor, my wife was temporarily insane with grief over her friend's death. She wasn't in her right mind. I was perfectly sane, Kate corrected. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I'd do it again. Agnes Hughes found her voice. Arrest her. She confessed. Arrest her for murder. Judge Anderson looked between the women, the situation spiraling beyond anything he'd expected. This is highly irregular. Mrs. Morrison, I'm obligated to, Your Honor. A new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Reverend Mills approaching along with Martha Murphy and several other townspeople. We need to speak. Reverend, the judge looked confused. Kate Morrison has been with me and my wife every September 15th for the past 6 years, Reverend Mills said clearly. It's the anniversary of her mother's death. We hold a vigil at the church. She couldn't have been in Missouri that night. Martha Murphy nodded. I was there too. We were all together from sunset to dawn. Kate stared at them. But I wasn't. Yes, you were, Martha said firmly, meeting Kate's eyes with steel in her own. We all remember it clearly, don't we? One by one, the townspeople nodded. They were lying, all of them creating an alibi from whole cloth. Sarah realized with stunning clarity that the entire town had closed ranks to protect Kate Morrison. Judge Anderson wasn't fooled, but he recognized what was happening. The town had decided its own justice. He turned to Agnes Hughes. It seems your husband's killer will remain a mystery, Mrs. Hughes. Without evidence or credible witnesses, there's no case against Mr. Coleman or anyone else. Agnes looked around wildly, seeing the unified front against her. You're all protecting a killer. This is conspiracy. This is community, Martha Murphy said quietly. Something you wouldn't understand. Agnes turned to Prescott. Do something. There must be legal recourse. There's nothing, Mrs. Hughes, Prescott said wearily. No witness, no evidence, and now Mrs. Morrison has an alibi. It's over. It's not over. Agnes's composure finally shattered completely. I'll hire investigators. I'll find proof. I'll see someone hang for Carlton's death. Your husband is dead, Joe said quietly. Nothing you do will bring him back, and pursuing this will only ensure that everyone knows exactly what kind of man he was. Is that really what you want? For his victims to come forward? For the whole truth to be known? Agnes stared at him, hatred burning in her eyes. You think you've won. You think you can just live happily ever after with your whore. Sarah stepped forward, but Joe caught her arm. We think we can live in peace, which is more than your husband allowed his victims. Judge Anderson mounted his horse. This matter is closed. Mrs. Hughes, I suggest you return to Missouri. Mr. Coleman, you're free to continue your life without harassment. Any further attempts at prosecution will be viewed as malicious persecution. Agnes Hughes left in a fury of dust and threats, Prescott trailing behind. The townspeople dispersed slowly, each stopping to nod at Joe and Sarah, a silent acknowledgement of solidarity. Kate Morrison hugged Sarah tight. Take care of him, she whispered. You both deserve happiness. After everyone left, Sarah, Joe, and Sam stood in the yard, processing the morning's events. They all lied for us, Sarah said wonderingly. They lied for Kate, Joe corrected, but also for justice. Real justice, not the legal kind. Sam clapped Joe on the shoulder. You've got good people here. Sarah, you chose well. I didn't choose the place, Sarah said, looking at Joe. I chose the person. That evening, as Sam slept in the main room exhausted from his journey, Sarah found Joe standing in the barn, staring at the beam where Elizabeth had died. She slipped her hand into his. It's over, she said softly. Hughes's death is over. But Elizabeth is still gone. The pain she carried, the baby, she couldn't bear to birth, none of that. is fixed. No, Sarah agreed. But Kate avenged her. The town protected that vengeance. And now we have a chance to build something from the ashes. That's what Elizabeth would want, isn't it? For you to live, really live, not just exist. Joe turned to her, his eyes wet. I don't know how. Neither do I, Sarah admitted. But maybe we can learn together. He kissed her then there in the barn where death had once ruled a kiss that was promise and plea combined. When they parted, Sarah saw something new in his eyes, not the absence of grief, but the presence of hope alongside it. Marry me, Joe said suddenly. Tomorrow, before Sam leaves so he can give you away proper. Joe Coleman, is that a proposal or a command? It's a desperate request from a man who's wasted too much time on guilt and not enough on living. He dropped to one knee right there in the barn straw. Sarah McAllister, you came to me broken and gave me purpose. You stood by me when I didn't deserve it. You fought for me when I wouldn't fight for myself. Will you marry me? Sarah looked down at this good man scarred by loss, but not destroyed by it, and felt her own scars throb with remembered pain. They were both damaged, perhaps permanently, but damage didn't mean worthless. Yes, she said simply. Sam gave his blessing the next morning, though not without extracting promises from Joe about Sarah's treatment and threatening bodily harm if those promises were broken. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony that afternoon in the small church with Kate and Doc Morrison as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Sarah wore her good dress, the one Joe had bought her that first week. Joe wore his church clothes uncomfortable, but determined. When Reverend Mills asked for the rings, Joe produced two, a simple gold band for himself, and for Sarah, something that made her gasp. It was Elizabeth's, he said quietly, so only she could hear. Kate saved it, gave it to me this morning. Said Elizabeth would want you to have it, that love shouldn't be buried with the dead. Sarah looked at the delicate ring, understanding the weight of this gesture. Are you sure? I'm sure that Elizabeth loved me enough to want me happy, and I'm sure you make me happy. The rest is just metal and memory. She let him slide the ring onto her finger, felt the circle close between past and present. When Reverend Mills pronounced them married and Joe kissed her, the church erupted in celebration. These people who had barely known her 6 months ago now claimed her as their own, one of the community that had stood against injustice. That night, as Sarah lay in Joe's arms in the bed they now shared as husband and wife, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From Illinois to Tucson, from Thornton's fist to Joe's gentle hands, from broken to whole, or at least broken in a way that matched Joe's broken edges fitting together like puzzle pieces. What are you thinking? Joe asked, his voice drowsy with contentment. That Martha Murphy was right that first day. God does work in mysterious ways. You think God wanted you to suffer with Thornton just to bring you to me? Sarah turned to face him. No, I think God gave us free will, and people like Thornton use it for evil. But I also think sometimes grace comes from surviving that evil, from finding love in unlikely places. Like a ranch in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. Like the arms of a man who knew what it was to lose everything and still chose to offer kindness to a stranger. Recount chapter 472. The seasons turned, and with them Sarah's body began to change. It was Martha Murphy who noticed first, pulling her aside after church on a bright February morning 3 months after the wedding. You're carrying, aren't you? The older woman said gently, her knowing eyes taking in Sarah's fuller face, the way she pressed her hand to her stomach when she thought no one was looking. Sarah nodded, tears springing to her eyes. I haven't told Joe yet, I'm afraid. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Martha understood. Elizabeth had been carrying when she died, unable to bear the thought of birthing her rapist's child. How would Joe react to Sarah carrying his own? That man loves you something fierce, Martha said firmly. This baby is a blessing, not a curse. You tell him tonight. But that evening, as Sarah prepared Joe's favorite meal and tried to find the words, Sam arrived unexpectedly, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. He'd been working at a ranch 50 miles south, visiting when he could, but this wasn't a social call. His face was grim as he dismounted. We've got trouble, he said without preamble. Agnes Hughes is dead. Joe stepped onto the porch, his expression sharpening. What happened? Murdered in her hotel room in Tucson, shot twice just like her husband. Sam accepted the water Sarah brought him, drinking deeply. The thing is, before she died, she apparently wrote a letter claiming you threatened her Joe. Said if anything happened to her, you were responsible. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Not again. They couldn't go through this again. Joe's hand found hers squeezing tight. When did this happen? Joe asked, his voice carefully controlled. 3 nights ago. Marshal Thompson's on his way here with a federal judge. They want to question you and Sarah, too. Sam looked between them. Where were you 3 nights ago? Here, Joe said. We were here together. Anyone else see you? Any witnesses? Sarah thought back. 3 nights ago had been the night she'd first suspected she was pregnant, the night she'd been so sick. Joe had held her hair while she vomited, had brought her cool cloths and weak tea. They'd been entirely alone. No witnesses, she said quietly. Just us. Sam cursed under his breath. That's not good. A husband and wife alibying each other won't hold much weight, especially with your history with the Hughes family. Before Joe could respond, scouts started barking. Riders were approaching, many of them. Marshal Thompson led the group, his face professionally neutral, but behind him rode men Sarah didn't recognize. Federal men by the look of them, with the cold efficiency of those who enforce law without caring about justice. Coleman, Thompson called out, "We need to talk." Joe stepped forward, keeping Sarah behind him. Talk. Agnes Hughes is dead. Before she died, she sent letters to the federal prosecutor claiming you'd threatened her life. We need you to come with us for questioning. He didn't threaten anyone, Sarah said, moving beside her husband. Agnes Hughes had many enemies. She was a vindictive woman who destroyed lives for sport. One of the federal men, thin and sharp-featured like a knife blade, smiled coldly. Mrs. Coleman, I presume the former, Mrs. Thornton. Your defense of your husband is touching, but hardly objective. My name is Sarah Coleman, she said firmly. And my husband was with me 3 nights ago. All night. How convenient, the thin man said. A wife can't be compelled to testify against her husband, and you're his only alibi. Almost like you planned it that way. Joe tensed, and Sarah knew he was close to violence. She pressed her hand to his arm, grounding him. We didn't plan anything. We were living our lives trying to forget the Hughes family existed. Marshal Thompson dismounted, his expression troubled. Joe, I don't want to arrest you, but these federal boys have authority. If you come quietly, answer questions, maybe we can sort this out. The way we sorted it out last time, Joe asked bitterly. With false witnesses and purchased testimony. There's more, Thompson said reluctantly. Agnes Hughes's hotel room, there was a message written in blood on the mirror. For Elizabeth. Whoever killed her wanted it known this was revenge for your wife. Sarah's mind raced. Who would kill Agnes Hughes and deliberately implicate Joe who even knew about Elizabeth anymore? Most of the people who'd known her were either dead or Kate Morrison. Sarah's blood ran cold. Kate, who'd killed Carlton Hughes for Elizabeth. Kate, who'd been prepared to confess until the town protected her. Would she kill again to protect the secret, I need to speak with my husband privately, Sarah said suddenly. The thin federal man laughed. So you can coordinate your stories. So I can tell him something that might explain who really killed Agnes Hughes, Sarah shot back, unless you'd prefer to arrest the wrong man and let the real killer go free. Thompson nodded slowly. 5 minutes. Sarah pulled Joe into the house, speaking urgently. It was Kate. It had to be. She killed Carlton for Elizabeth and now Agnes for threatening us. She's protecting us again. Joe's face went white. No, Kate wouldn't. She has too much to lose now. She's already a killer, Joe. What's one more death to someone who's already crossed that line? We can't let her hang for us. We can't let you hang either. Sarah grabbed his shoulders. Joe, I'm pregnant. I'm carrying our child. I can't lose you. Not now, not when we finally have a chance at happiness. Joe stared at her, stunned. We're... Yes. Tears streamed down her face. So please, please don't sacrifice yourself for some misguided sense of honor. Our baby needs a father. Joe pulled her against him, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. A baby, he whispered against her hair. Our baby. A sharp knock interrupted them. Time's up, Thompson called. They emerged to find the federal men growing impatient, but before anyone could speak, another rider appeared on the horizon. Doc Morrison, riding hard, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle. "Marshal," he called out, breathless. "I have information about Agnes Hughes's death." The thin federal man sneered. "Another convenient alibi from the helpful townspeople." "No," Doc Morrison said, dismounting heavily. "A medical opinion. I've just come from Tucson. The federal coroner let me examine Agnes Hughes's body." "That's highly irregular," the thin man protested, "but legal with Marshal Thompson's permission, which he gave." Doc Morrison pulled out a notebook. Agnes Hughes was killed with a .32 caliber pistol, not the .44 that killed her husband. The angle of the wound suggests someone significantly shorter than her shot upward, and most importantly, she had defensive wounds on her hands and laudanum in her system. "What does that mean?" Thompson asked. "It means she knew her killer. She let them close enough to drug her tea, but fought when she realized their intent." Doc Morrison looked directly at Joe. "Mr. Coleman is 6 feet tall and owns only .44 caliber weapons. He's also never been known to use laudanum." "He could have acquired these things," the thin federal man argued. "More importantly," Doc Morrison continued, "I have 3 witnesses who saw a woman in widow's weeds leaving the hotel near the time of death, a small woman with dark hair." Sarah's mind immediately went to Kate, but Kate had light brown hair and she wasn't particularly small. "Who else would—" "That would be me," a voice said from behind them. Everyone turned to see a woman approaching on foot from the direction of town. She was indeed small with dark hair, wearing the black dress of mourning. But it wasn't Kate Morrison. It was Maria Rodriguez, the elderly Mexican woman who'd been Joe's housekeeper before Sarah arrived. "Maria," Joe said, shocked, "what are you doing here?" The old woman walked steadily despite her age, her face serene. "I am here to confess, Senor Coleman. I killed Agnes Hughes." The silence was absolute. Then everyone began talking at once. Marshal Thompson restored order with effort, then faced Maria. "You're confessing to murder." "See? Yes, I shot her 3 nights ago in Tucson." "Why?" the thin federal man demanded. Maria's dark eyes flashed. "Because she was evil. Because she tortured her husband's victims with her presence. Because she would not stop until Senor Coleman was destroyed." "You didn't even know Elizabeth Coleman," Thompson said, confused. "No, but I knew Lucia Valdez and Carmen Reyes and my own daughter Rosa." Maria's voice broke on the last name. "All women Carlton Hughes destroyed before he ever touched Elizabeth Coleman. All women who died by their own hands rather than live with what he did to them." Sarah gasped. 3 more victims, 3 more women driven to suicide by Hughes's violence. Maria continued, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I worked for the Hughes family for 20 years. I saw what he did. I kept silent because I needed the work, because my family needed the money. But when my own daughter became his victim and hanged herself in shame, I could not bear it anymore." "So you killed Carlton Hughes?" Thompson asked. "No, I was going to, but someone else did it first. I thought justice was finally done. But then his widow came here trying to destroy the one good man who'd stood up to her husband. She had to be stopped." "How did you even know she was in Tucson?" the thin federal man asked suspiciously. "I have family there. They work in the hotel. They told me she was staying there planning more evil against Senor Coleman." Maria reached into her pocket, and several men reached for their guns, but she only pulled out a rosary. "I put laudanum in her tea. I wanted her sleepy, peaceful, but she recognized me, started screaming about her husband, about how I'd stolen from them. So I shot her, twice, like someone shot him." "You wrote the message," Thompson said, "for Elizabeth. For all of them. Elizabeth, Lucia, Carmen, Rosa. For all the women he destroyed and she enabled." Maria looked at Joe. "You tried to get justice the legal way, senor, but sometimes God's justice comes through other hands." The federal men huddled, conferring. Sarah held Joe's arm, feeling him tremble with shock and grief. This elderly woman had carried this burden, had committed murder for women long dead, for a justice the law would never provide. Finally, the thin federal man spoke. "Maria Rodriguez, you're under arrest for the murder of Agnes Hughes." Maria nodded calmly. I expected this. No, Joe said suddenly. She's confused. Her daughter's death affected her mind. She doesn't know what she's saying. I know exactly what I am saying, Senor Coleman. Maria smiled sadly at him. You are a good man. You deserve a good life with your good wife. Do not waste it on guilt for things that were not your fault. As Thompson prepared to take Maria into custody, Kate Morrison arrived in her carriage, Doc Morrison having clearly sent word. She took in the scene with one glance and went straight to Maria. You foolish, brave woman, she said softly. Maria looked at her knowingly. We do what we must for justice, no. Kate's eyes filled with tears, understanding passing between them. Two women who'd taken justice into their own hands, who'd crossed the line of law for the sake of right. I'll get you a lawyer, Kate said. The best possible. No need, Maria said peacefully. I am old. Prison or hanging, it makes no difference. My Rosa is waiting for me. As the marshals led Maria away, Sarah heard her whispering prayers in Spanish, her voice calm and certain. The crowd that had gathered parted silently, some crossing themselves, others simply bearing witness to this small woman who'd carried such terrible purpose. After they were gone, Joe sank onto the porch steps, head in his hands. All this death, he said hollowly, all this pain spreading out like ripples from one evil man's actions. Sarah sat beside him, taking his hand. Maria chose this, just like Kate chose to kill Carlton. You didn't make those choices. But they made them because of me, because of Elizabeth. No. Sarah's voice was firm. They made them because of Carlton Hughes and his evil. Maria's daughter died before Elizabeth did. She would have acted regardless. Sam, who'd been silent through everything, finally spoke. She's right, Joe. Evil creates its own consequences. Hughes created his own death through his actions. His widow created hers through her vengeance. You're just the excuse, not the cause. That night, as they lay in bed, Joe's hand resting wonderingly on Sarah's still flat stomach, he said, a baby. In all this death and darkness, we're creating life. Elizabeth would be happy for you, Sarah said softly. How do you know? Sarah thought of the journal of Elizabeth's words of love for Joe, her wish for his happiness even in her darkest moments. Because she loved you. Real love wants happiness for the beloved even after death. Do you think Maria will hang? Sarah considered. She's elderly, clearly acting from grief. She might get mercy. She doesn't want mercy. You heard her, she wants to join her daughter. They were quiet for a moment, then Joe said, I want to name the baby Rosa if it's a girl, for Maria's daughter, for all of them. Sarah turned to kiss him. And if it's a boy, Samuel, for your brother, for family that survives. The trial of Maria Rodriguez became the talk of the territory. The elderly woman stood proudly in court, refusing her lawyer's attempts at an insanity defense, insisting she'd known exactly what she was doing. She spoke eloquently of her daughter, of the other victims of the years of silence that had eaten at her soul like acid. The jury, 12 men who'd all known Carlton Hughes's reputation, took only an hour to deliberate. They returned a verdict of guilty, but with a recommendation for mercy. The judge, perhaps influenced by the crowd of women who filled his courtroom every day of the trial, sentenced Maria to life in prison rather than hanging. Maria received the sentence with dignity, but her health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly in custody. She died 6 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, Rosa's name on her lips. The prison chaplain said she'd been smiling. Sarah and Joe attended her funeral along with most of Cedar Ridge. Even Wade Garrison came standing at the back, his usual smirk replaced by something approaching respect. As they lowered Maria's simple coffin into the ground beside her daughter's grave, Reverend Mills spoke of justice and mercy, of the terrible choices love sometimes demands. Kate Morrison stood beside Sarah, both women understanding they were burying a sister in survival, a woman who'd done what they'd all thought of doing. She saved us, Kate said quietly. All of us. She saved herself, Sarah corrected, from the guilt of silence. As spring arrived, Sarah's pregnancy became obvious, her body swelling with new life. Joe was tender with her, protective, but not smothering, treating her pregnancy like the miracle they both knew it to be. The ranch prospered, their garden bloomed, and slowly the shadow of the Hughes family faded. Sam visited regularly, working Joe's ranch between his own jobs, building a relationship with his brother-in-law based on mutual respect and shared love for Sarah. He was there the morning Sarah's water broke, riding hell for leather to fetch Doc Morrison, while Joe held Sarah's hand through the contractions. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted as the pain intensified. "You're the strongest woman I know," Joe said, kissing her sweat-dampened forehead. "You survived Thornton. You stood up to Agnes Hughes. You rebuilt yourself from nothing. You can do this." The labor was long and difficult, but Sarah thought of Maria Rodriguez, of Elizabeth Coleman, of all the women who'd suffered and survived or died trying. She would not let their sacrifice be in vain. She would bring this child into the world, would raise it in love and strength, would teach it that sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms. When Doc Morrison finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, Sarah wept with joy and exhaustion. "It's a girl," the doctor said, smiling. "A healthy, perfect girl." Joe's eyes were wet as he looked at his daughter, this tiny person who represented redemption and hope. "Rosa," he said softly. "Rosa Elizabeth Coleman." "She's beautiful," Sam said from the doorway, his own eyes suspiciously moist. "Looks like her mother." "God help her then." Sarah laughed through her tears. As she nursed her daughter for the first time, Sarah marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From a desperate mail-order bride to a battered woman fleeing abuse from a housekeeper to a wife from broken to whole, or at least whole enough to create new life. Kate Morrison visited the next day, bringing a beautifully embroidered blanket. "For Rosa," she said, admiring the baby. "May she never know the pain we've known." "She'll know pain," Sarah said realistically. "But she'll also know she's loved. She's valued. She's worth fighting for." Kate smiled sadly. "That's all any of us really need to know." As summer ripened into fall, Sarah stood in her garden, Rosa sleeping in a basket beside her, watching Joe work with the horses. He moved with easy grace, no longer carrying his grief like a visible weight. He would always mourn Elizabeth, just as Sarah would always carry the scars of Thornton's abuse. But they'd learned to build happiness on the foundation of sorrow, to create beauty from ashes. Sam had taken a permanent job at a neighboring ranch close enough to visit weekly to be the uncle Rosa deserved. He was courting Martha Murphy's niece, a sweet girl named Claire, who didn't mind his rough edges. Sarah had hopes of a wedding by Christmas. Wade Garrison had surprisingly become almost civil, tipping his hat when he saw them in town, no longer making crude offers or implications. Maria Rodriguez's dignity in the face of death had affected even him, apparently. The legal troubles were past. The Hughes family's influence finally ended with Agnes's death and Maria's confession. There would be no more marshals at their door, no more accusations or threats of extradition. They were free to live their lives in peace. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner with Rosa cooing in her cradle, Joe came in from the range. He kissed Sarah first, then bent to touch his daughter's tiny hand. The baby gripped his finger with surprising strength, and Joe's face softened with wonder that hadn't diminished in the 3 months since her birth. "How did we get so lucky?" he asked. Sarah thought of all the pain that had led them here, Elizabeth's suicide, Thornton's abuse, the violence and accusations, and fear. Lucky seemed the wrong word. "Not lucky," she said. "Blessed. Blessed by the sacrifices of others, by the courage of women like Maria and Kate, by the community that chose justice over law. We're here because people fought for us, died for us, lied for us." Joe nodded slowly. "Then we owe it to them to live well." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "We owe them happiness." As the sun set over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah stood with her husband and daughter, thinking of Elizabeth's journal, of the question the dead woman had posed. Can you rebuild a person from broken pieces, or do you just create something new from the wreckage? The answer, Sarah knew now, was both. She was not the naive girl from Illinois, nor was she Thornton's victim. She was Sarah Coleman, wife, mother, survivor. She was built from broken pieces, yes, but the breaking had revealed strength she'd never known she possessed. The wreckage had become foundation. The scars had become stories. The pain had become purpose. Rosa began to fuss, and Sarah picked her up, holding her daughter close. This child would grow up knowing she was loved, that she had worth beyond what men assigned her, that justice sometimes came from unexpected hands. She would know her namesake's story, not just the tragedy, but the courage. She would understand that sometimes the law and justice were different things, and that women throughout history had navigated that difference with wisdom and strength. Joe wrapped his arms around both of them, his chin resting on Sarah's head. "What are you thinking?" "That we've come so far from that day you found me at the stage depot." "You found yourself," Joe corrected. "I just gave you space to do it." Sarah turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd offered her dignity when the world wanted to destroy it. "We found each other." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside their home, not a house of sorrow anymore, but a home of second chances. The ghosts were still there, would always be there, but they were peaceful ghosts now, satisfied that justice in its own way had been served. Tomorrow there would be chores and challenges, the ordinary business of living. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, there was love. Tonight, there was hope. And in the end, Sarah thought, as she nursed Rosa by lamplight, while Joe read aloud from a book of poetry, hope was the greatest justice of all. Hope that the future could be better than the past, that love could grow from loss, that broken people could create whole families. The desert wind whispered around their adobe walls, and Sarah could almost hear the voices of the women who'd made this possible. Elizabeth Maria Rosa Valdez and all the unnamed others who'd suffered and survived or died trying. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. Their story continued in this child, in this marriage, in this life built from the ashes of tragedy. "I love you," she told Joe, the words still feeling new and precious after months of marriage. "I love you too," he replied, marking his place in the book to look at her fully. "Both of you, all of us." It was a simple exchange, but it held volumes acknowledgement of the past, acceptance of the present, promise for the future. They were a family forged in fire, tested by trials, and ultimately triumphant, not because they'd won, but because they'd survived and chosen to thrive.